President Muhammadu Buhari is seeking the approval of Nigeria's National Assembly to borrow about $4 billion and 710 million euros. These loans would be taken from bilateral and multilateral organizations to fund the deficit in the 2021 budget. The president, in a letter to the Senate, said the request is an addendum to the 2018 to 2020 borrowing plan. He also asked the lawmakers to approve grant components of $125 million. It was in July this year that the Nigerian Senate approved the federal government's 2018 to 2020 external borrowing rolling plan of $8.3 billion and 490 million euros. Donor-funded projects under the plan, according to the president, would be financed through sovereign loans from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, the French Development Agency, and the China Exim Bank. This new request is scheduled to be financed through sovereign loans from the same international lenders and others. These loans will add to a series of borrowings which the government intends to use to try to jumpstart an economy disrupted by COVID-19 and dollar shortages. Our topic today is Nigeria seeks fresh loans. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me is Gbolahan Olojede. He's an economist and the Executive Director, DMA Advisory and Management Services Limited. Gbolahan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get straight to it. Now, Africa's largest economy came out of its second recession since 2019 in the fourth quarter of 2020. Growth is fragile. All revenue is fluctuating and down. So are you surprised that Nigeria is seeking another loan to fund its budget deficits?
No, I'm not surprised. That is because, number one, we had what you call the borrowing plan. That was a 2018 to 2021, I think, borrowing plan, which has been presented before. And I think we had an approval of the National Assembly. The second part is that when the budget for this year was presented, we saw that there was a deficit of over 5 trillion naira. And the government had said, look, I don't have the revenues for these 5-point-something trillion. I will be borrowing both internationally and locally to be able to make it up. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that they're now saying, okay, that money where I say I go borrow, I'm now about to borrow it. So that's why I'm not surprised.
There is an expected budget deficit of 5.6 trillion naira. The Buhari administration is looking to finance this largely from foreign and local borrowings. Now, budget deficits are not so uncommon, and many countries are experiencing them in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is Nigeria's deficit too much? Is it cause for concern, or is it to be expected and really there's no need for alarm?
What is really of concern is not Nigeria's deficit, it is Nigeria's revenue. Nigeria's revenue is horrible. I was somewhere yesterday where I was talking about the Nigerian police, and we were comparing them with the Metropolitan Police. That was when I found out that the budget for the Metropolitan Police for 1 year is about twice the total Nigerian revenue. I don't know if you got that. About 40,000 plus policemen in the UK. The amount voted for them is bigger than the entire amount that Nigeria, federal government Nigeria wanted to spend. So the main problem is actually revenue, not the deficit, like you rightly said. So what we must be asking is, at the heart of it, how do we deal with the revenue issue? And then the second part is that what can we do to ensure that we don't have to borrow as much, because the trend of borrowing is unsustainable. At some point, the risk profile is increasing, then we will have to start borrowing at a higher cost. At some point, you might even get to the market and the creditors are saying, look, I'm not so sure you guys will be able to pay back, so I don't have any money for you. We don't want to get to that point. So what do we need to begin to do to ensure that we borrow less? Now, let me also say that our approach of waiting for every 3-4 months and then the government says, I want to borrow. When they come like that, it has become a short-term need. There is not much you can do in a short term. Where we need to plug in is when we have a plan. So if there's a 3-year borrowing plan, 3 years gives us a room to maneuver. So we can say, oh, within these 3 years, don't borrow this amount. Let's give this to the private sector to handle. Let's do a tax credit to finance this particular road. Let's sell this asset. Government has huge number of assets that are totally unproductive, useless assets that we can realize, and we can begin to use it to part fund our deficit. So there are so many things we can do, but once the borrowing becomes, it comes on a short-term basis, there's nothing you can do in a short term, but a 3-year plan gives us the room to maneuver, and that is what we must plug into. So what is the next 2-3 years of borrowing that we have right now on the table? If we have something like that, let's plug into it and provide solutions. It's not enough to just be saying, oh, borrowing. What are the solutions? And that time frame gives us the opportunity for solutions.
Let's quickly go deeper into this budget deficit aspect of the conversation. Now, Nigeria is basically spending more money than she's making and has been for some time. The country is then borrowing to close the gap between income and spending, which increases the national debt. But there are some that believe that borrowing can boost a sluggish economy. And people often point to the U.S. as an example of a country that has consistently run deficits over the past decade. Particularly for Nigeria, what are the effects of a budget deficit on the economy?
For us, the problem is so glaring, and it comes in several forms. Number one is that because we're not earning enough revenue, this debt, this borrowing becomes a burden. We have seen situations in which 80%, 90% of our entire revenue is being used to service loan. It means that we don't even have money for development. We don't have money for capital investment, which is why we go out there to go and borrow again to come and, in fact, we are probably already borrowing to handle some of our recurrent expenditure. Because when you look at the 2020 numbers, the 2020 numbers shows that the total revenue we made, the retained revenue of the federal government of Nigeria, could not cover the non-debt recurrent expenditure of the country. So we might already have started to borrow to do some recurrent expenditure or to borrow to repay another loan. It's already in that system. So we cannot continue along this line. There's nothing wrong in deficits. Several countries that are doing well in the world are also borrowing to do things. But we must get our revenues right. Right now, it is horrible.
Borrowing in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, and literally every country on the planet does borrow. But in Nigeria's case, we tend to hear alarm bells and sirens and more when it's announced that the country wants to borrow. What's the issue with Nigeria, in particular, borrowing?
Fantastic. I will remind you that when the government presented a borrowing plan, 3 or 4 year borrowing plan, I cannot remember precisely now, there was an item that stuck to my head. I think it was revamp of NTA, something like that. And it was some huge numbers. So I must be asking myself, if I turn around or I digitize NTA, should it be a priority borrowing project? Is that a borrowing project? It is totally different from if I'm borrowing to do a critical road, or I'm borrowing to do a critical rail infrastructure. Anybody who has gotten on the Lagos-Ibadan rail will tell you that they had a fantastic experience. If I must move both goods and people across the country efficiently, which is part of what we enable the economy, it is good borrowing, because at the end of the day, the enablement that will be delivered into the economy will actually help us to generate revenue for the government. When businesses are doing better, they are in a more comfortable position to pay you taxes and to employ people, and so all the benefits will come when we borrow right and we spend it right. So one of the questions we must ask about this particular borrowing is, can we see the list of the projects?
All right, Gbolahan, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get a bit deeper into this loan issue and look at what it means for the economy. You're watching Business Edge. Welcome back. Now, still with me is Gbolahan Olojede. So, Gbolahan, let's continue this. Now, in July, lawmakers gave approval for government to borrow $8.4 billion, 490 million euros, and now we're in September. The president has asked for more, and he says that this fresh request is to address emerging needs and ensure that all critical projects approved by FEC as of June 2021 are incorporated. What do you think the national economic needs could be that would push Nigeria to borrow again after July's round?
That is why we should be asking for these details. Nigeria indeed has, if you just use infrastructure alone, the deficit that is in that space alone, even if we continue to borrow for the next, at the rate we are for the next 10 years, I'm not sure if we'll be able to deal with up to 50% of what we have that is missing on ground. But you see, in the process of saying we are borrowing for critical capital expenditure, there might be several other items that are not considered critical, that are being smuggled into it. And it is only when we know exactly what this list is. If somebody says, oh, I'm borrowing $8 billion, okay, $8 billion, that is fine. What are the breakdown of this $8 billion? What are the specific projects that are there? When we know the specific project, somebody say, oh, part of this money is going to be deployed to the coastal rail from Lagos to Calabar. Fantastic infrastructure. But there are some other things that when you see it, you know that this is money for the boys. And Nigerians can write and say, we do not support that this particular one be funded. So if it is about the need is there, plenty. What we should focus on is our revenue and the sustainability of the pattern of borrowing that we have right now. In the short term, we may have to borrow, but because we have a plan, the plan, if you have a 3-year plan, it allows us to ensure that no matter that gap, what that gap is, that we don't have to borrow the entire gap over 3 years.
The 2018 to 2020 funding plan is meant to boost the Nigerian Economic Sustainability Plan, which in turn is to fund Nigeria's COVID-19 recovery. The $5.9 billion plan was approved in order to stimulate and diversify the economy, retain and create jobs, and also extend more protections to the poor. How successful do you think the NESP has been so far?
I don't think we have done much because if we have done much, it should have started to reflect in certain parts of the economy, which we are not yet really feeling it. That is not to say that we have not done some stuff. Some infrastructure have been delivered. There is no doubt about that. And part of our question should also be towards that. If somebody has come to us and said, I want to borrow, and they borrow this much, he said, this thing I'm borrowing are for this project, this project, this project. As citizens, as civil society organization, as National Assembly, we must be able to query those projects and the level of delivery that we have for those projects. I'm going to do 100 kilometers of road, and that is why I'm borrowing this 100 million. Can we ask, so how many kilometers of those that the road has been delivered? Our jobs do not end and should not end at the level of, talking about the loan. Whenever they come, we say, oh, you want to borrow, you want to borrow. That is not where it stops. So after they have borrowed, has the money been applied to what they said it was going to be applied to? What is the level of performance at any point in time? When did they say they were going to conclude it? Have they concluded it accordingly? All those things are things we must measure as citizens. If we just focus on that point in time when they say they want to borrow, and then after that, we drop the ball, we're going to move forward.
Now, there have been a lot of criticisms of some of the previously obtained loans because of terms, conditions, and even transparency issues. What kind of terms do you think would be most favorable to Nigeria and Nigerians when it comes to loans and borrowing?
Number one, any money we're asking for has to be concessionary. So all those international loans with FX implications, the rate has to be concessionary. And for some of this loan, I actually think we must think about hedging. I can imagine foreign denominated loan that were taken when the naira to the dollar was 200 naira. And today, that same naira to the dollar is 500 naira. There's a huge FX risk with international borrowing. So part of the term, part of the negotiations for contracting this loan should be to also think about the hedging mechanism for us so that we don't run into the FX risk that are associated with international borrowing in an unstable FX situation. Then we need to define certain ratios by ourselves, apart from the generally the popular one that by World Bank and all the rest of it. I believe that by now we should have determined internally and made public what is the maximum debt service ratio that is acceptable to us as a country. What is it? The debt service to the revenue of because the temptation, which is what I hear government say all the time, is to want to peg our borrowing to the GDP and say our debt to GDP ratio is sustainable, it's still very low, one of the lowest in the world, lowest in Africa, all those kind of things. This is not the right way to go. That is because the GDP that we are indexing our loan to, there's a lot of distortion about it. Nobody repays loan from GDP. You repay your loan from revenues, and the revenues are bad. So what is the ratio of the loan to that revenue that is acceptable to us as a country? We need to begin to define those clearly and let it guide us. Maybe we even push us to go and look for more revenue.
Let's take a quick trip down memory lane. So in October 2005, the Olusegun Obasanjo administration was successful in getting debt relief from the Paris Club. The country got debt relief worth $18 billion and an overall reduction of its debt stock by about $30 billion. How did Nigeria end up with now $87 billion and more of debt as of June this year? Even though, yes, this does include debt from all levels of government.
We were borrowing and borrowing recklessly. We were not applying the money we were borrowing to what we said we were going to apply them to. So we were literally just wasting the money. That is it. If we have been borrowing for 15 years, and you look in that space and you say, oh, maybe we've been borrowing for infrastructure, and you're asking yourself, so where is the infrastructure? Till now, the power is still not exactly there. A whole lot of road issues are still there. A whole lot of our infrastructure, even Apapa is still there. I think well enough in holding government accountable to some of these borrowings that they have been making. And it may be a gap that we need to start thinking of how to fill. If we don't fill that gap, we will continue to ask ourselves, 5 years down the lane again, we will ask ourselves, okay, all that money that we talked about today, how come we cannot see the infrastructure? So more accountability must be demanded from the people who are doing the borrowing or who are implementing all this project. Borrowing itself, like anybody will say, is not a bad thing. It is what you use the money for and how you are accountable for the money that you have borrowed that is the problem.
The last question seems a very simple one, but it's probably one of the biggest questions many people are asking themselves. Gbolahan, how does Nigeria get its borrowing under control to a manageable and sustainable level?
What we need to do is to, within the plan, when we make a plan, 2-3 year plan, it gives us time to maneuver. So within that time, we number one, bring in increased private sector participation. So, for example, we have tax credits being used to fund some roads. So Nigeria did not have to borrow for that. We have a whole lot of initiative under the Federal Ministry of Works, which is going in that direction as well. Number two, we can begin to consider all sorts of concessions and PPP arrangement. Number three, we are able to negotiate some of the existing loans that are either maturing or are short-term. We negotiate it such that we can extend the maturity a little bit. What that does is that it reduces the burden of what we are paying here. I make it smaller and less burdensome to us. So we can also exit a whole lot of federal government assets that are useless and unproductive, from real estate to government enterprises that are not doing anything. Let's exit some of these assets and get in some money. This is easier for us than to just be doing all this short term. Oh, you want to borrow again? No, you can't borrow. No, that one is not going to work.
Thank you so much, Gbolahan Olojede, Economist and Executive Director, DMA Advisory and Management Services. Thank you for joining me on Business Edge. And that's the edition of Business Edge that we have for you today. As always, don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. And if you've missed any of our conversations on the biggest economic, financial, and of course, business stories coming out of the continent, head to our YouTube channel and of course, subscribe. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. I'll see you again soon.